so grateful to be a part of this really important conversation tonight. So I will caveat and say that I am not an attorney. I'm a social worker, but I do work for the Seattle City Attorney's Office. So I'll do a formal intro. My name is Alyssa Shaw. I'm the Extreme Risk Protection Order advocate with the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit. That unit, we are a collaboration between the King County Prosecutor's Office, Seattle City Attorney's Office, where I work, and then our law enforcement partners, the Seattle Police Department, King County Sheriff's Office, as well as really all jurisdictions. We work primarily in King County, but what I'm here to talk about, extreme risk protection orders, is a state law. So it doesn't matter where you're living in Washington State. If you're watching this, the law applies. Just our work is centered around King County. So when I'm talking about the advocacy that I provide, that's primarily in King County, but anyone in the state can get in touch with our office and we do our best to help. So I'll go through and, I'm just so grateful and really in awe of Rob. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and my also condolences to your whole family. I think that, I've got some stats here about suicide, but Rob's story shows that, even one life lost to suicide affects so many people, a whole community. And like our previous speakers mentioned, Isabel mentioned that it's a huge problem in the nation and here in Washington State. So here's just some statistics and what I'm so grateful that we're talking about suicide when we're talking about firearms is because usually the gun violence prevention movement, suicides aren't really a part of that conversation. And usually when people talk about gun control and things like that, it can be very testy. We're not going to get into anything but the facts tonight. But usually it's about homicides. And unfortunately, the statistics that we know are that the majority of firearm deaths are from suicides. And like the slide shows, 51%, this is suicides just here in Washington State, over half of all of the suicides were from firearm injuries. So I like to say you can't talk about firearm injury prevention without talking about suicide, and you can't talk about suicide prevention without talking about firearms. So I'm really grateful for this conversation today. Again, like our previous, every speaker really mentioned, that the most effective thing you can do when you're looking to prevent suicide is to reduce lethal means and get time for that person to get the help they need, change their mind, whatever the case. And so, Rob, you asked if one of the speakers had the stats. So I looked it up because I didn't put it in this presentation, but I had it from a previous one. So 90% of suicide attempts that involve firearms end up resulting in a death, compared to about 4% of suicide attempts with other means. Wow. So it's just that gut reaction that you had, it's pretty straightforward, and the research and the stats really show that reducing the most lethal means that a person has to take their own life is a life-saving intervention. So if we can remove that firearm from a time when someone is suicidal, that's the intervention. Doesn't solve the problem, doesn't necessarily get them the help that they need in that moment, but it keeps them alive long enough so that all the other pieces can come together. Absolutely. And I apologize if there's I'm just getting the chat up here. So if there's questions, please, and feel free to interrupt me. I don't know why it's not coming up on my screen. Sorry about that.
Probably Val or Bonnie or someone will help us with that. So you can just kind of continue there, Alyssa.
Okay.
I just wanted to just kind of underline what you had said about when someone is suicidal. And I know that you're specifically going to talk about that with this ERPOs. And also, we don't always know when somebody is suicidal. And people are impulsive sometimes, particularly young people, when maybe they've just gravely disappointed somebody or themselves or something, and they're having a momentary reaction. So practicing that locking up and the safe storage and the safety is important, kind of just always, because you just don't know for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that this group of presentations that you put together tonight is so reflective of what I see in my work, which we usually, when we're talking with family members, we want to talk about how, you know, families, they have a menu of options. One of these pieces is not the end all be all. Doing the things that work for, you know, depending on what, there might be some homes that don't have medications in them. And so it's okay that that's not a piece. But again, knowing this information, so you know, well, what about the homes where my kids are going? Even if it's not happening in your home, it's really helpful to have this information so you're not caught in a situation where you don't know what to do because it might not be something you have in your home. So all of these, it's the whole purpose is just to let people know all the different options that are available. And of course, you know, I work in the legal system, and I understand that by the time things get to coming across my desk, typically families have tried everything else that they could. It's not a step that people take lightly, and we definitely understand that. So what I want to talk a little bit about is what we do every day, extreme risk protection orders. And you guys may have heard these orders talked about on a national level. Usually they get brought up after mass shootings. They're often referred to as red flag laws in other states. There's no federal extreme risk protection order law. There's only certain states that have them. Right now, I believe it's up to 15 different states that have some type of extreme risk protection order law. They're called different things in different states. California's is called a gun violence restraining order. But the whole purpose is exactly what we're talking about, to intervene and prevent a tragedy from happening. So one message that I want, you know, families to know is that there are actions that you can take to prevent harm from happening, whether that's safe storage, locking up your medication, or talking with me about an extreme risk protection order. I just want families to know that this is not a problem that we can't solve. There are things that we can all do. So what exactly is an extreme risk protection order? It is a civil court order, and I'll get into the specifics of it later, that allows family members and law enforcement to go to the court and ask for the court to remove the firearms from someone who is exhibiting signs of danger to themselves or others. So our law, again, here called an extreme risk protection order, sometimes we'll call it ERPO for short. It was passed by a citizens initiative in 2016. So the citizens of Washington state came together and said, this is a tool that we want to be able to use in our communities. So that law passed in 2016 and took effect in December of 2016. One thing I'll mention just with our unit, we didn't start by doing these extreme risk protection orders. Our unit started in January of 2018. So it had already been in place for a little over a year before our unit got started. But a month after our unit got started in 2018 was the school shooting in Parkland, Florida of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And it really reinvigorated the conversation about these extreme risk protection orders and what can people do when someone like the shooter in that case was exhibiting signs. People knew, people were worried, and they didn't have a mechanism to intervene. So of course, you know, sometimes we don't know when someone is suicidal, and sometimes they're telling you, and we need to be able to have tools to intervene when we know something is going on.
And that was a young person. I mean, a young adult by then, but a young person.
Yes, I don't know if he was technically over 18 at that point, but yes, definitely still a young person. So when we talk about, and these are not only behavioral signs for us to be aware of, but these are some of the signs that the court is actually looking for when they are deciding whether or not to grant an extreme risk protection order. And the one thing that we really want to make sure that people are thinking about is, yes, there are these factors, but we're really looking at someone's words, actions, and behaviors. So if they're saying they are suicidal, wanting to take their own life, and then, of course, having those conversations, we want to make sure that we have specific words, actions, and behaviors that we can point to show why they are a risk to harming themselves. So again, into the specifics, and I won't go too much into it, but I just want everyone to know if you have any questions about any of this, that is my whole job, is to answer questions and talk with people, even if an extreme risk protection order might not be appropriate right now. But generally, here are the big pieces that we want people to know. So again, it prohibits someone from purchasing and possessing a firearm for up to 1 year. There is an entire court process. There's due process protections built in. So it's not something where, someone can just go in and take someone's firearms and they have no say in it. There are full due process protections built in. But it is a mechanism to remove the firearms if someone already has them. And then another important piece is that it can prevent a legal purchase. So it might not mean anything to most people that it gets entered into these weird acronym databases at the bottom, but it is important on the legal side, because if there's an extreme risk protection order in place and someone goes to purchase a firearm legally, that will come up on their background check and prohibit them from lawfully purchasing that firearm. So it's really important, if you are working with someone or know somebody who is suicidal and they're talking about, oh, I'm going to go purchase this firearm to take my own life, this could still be an appropriate tool to use, even if they don't have one in their possession yet. One other thing to mention is that an extreme risk protection order does not offer any physical protections. So couple sides to that. The positive side is, if you are needing to petition for an extreme risk protection order against a family member, that means you still have contact with them. You can still be their support person. You can explain to them, I'm doing this to remove this lethal means you have. I'm doing this to save your life. On the opposite side of that, if you do have any concerns for your physical safety, we can talk about maybe what other type of order could remove the firearm as well as provide you some physical protections. So just want to mention that piece.
So Alyssa, we have a couple of questions.
Oh, yes, please.
That have come through.
Yeah.
And one of them is, you mentioned when you started that you often see people just at the end where they've tried all sorts of things, but when is the best time to actually access an extreme risk protection order?
I think that is up to the family member. I think this is one thing I forgot to mention, which is a good point to bring in here. It is lawful for someone to temporarily remove the firearms of someone else if they're suicidal. So I'll give a more concrete example so my wording is not confusing. So if a mom has concerns that her adult son is struggling, knows he has a gun, and maybe he relapsed, maybe he is struggling with suicidality, mom can take that gun from him. Even if it's registered to him, mom can remove that gun temporarily and keep it at her own house. So that's one thing that I've seen a lot of family members do, where they'll say, you know, I took the gun, we've got it locked up at uncle's house, we've got it at grandma's house, something like that. But they still are worried that either, you know, that the loved one might not want to be the one to have to decide whether or not to give it back. Right. And so there's a lot of situations. And I would say if you have any questions and just want to talk about your situation or just talk in hypotheticals, you can always call.
And we'll include your number, but is that also, you said that a mother could do that, but can other family members or friends for that matter?
I have it right here on this next slide. So under the law, there are two buckets of people that can apply for an extreme risk protection order. The first is law enforcement, and then the second is a family or household member. So here's the list of folks that can petition. So, but just family and household member is the big one. Unfortunately, that leaves out friends that you don't live with, neighbors, teachers, mental health professionals, doctors, things like that, that some other states have written in that some of those folks can be petitioners. Unfortunately, here it is limited at this moment to family and household members, but it's still pretty broad. I mean, roommate within the last year, and then any sort of blood relation, and then dating partners is, I think, really important to make sure of, and that's dating partners, even if you don't live together.
So we have another question that came in, which is it possible for them to find out who reported them, and when will they get their gun back?
So this is where it gets tricky with family members, is that the family member is the petitioner. And so right after you petition, so there's the two legal terms of petitioner, that's the person who asks for the order, and then the respondent, who is the person who is subject to the order. So we'll stick with this mom and son example just for continuity. So if mom petitions for an extreme risk protection order, she gets a temporary order granted by a judge. That order, everything she wrote in her petition gets served to her son. So all the concerns she has, the fact that she's the one who did it, it's part of the due process protections, is that the person needs to know who is making these allegations and taking my gun away. So it gets tricky. I'm not gonna, say that it doesn't get messy with family members, but again, this is what we're here for, and that's a conversation I'm have fairly often with family members to say, here are your options, but you have to do what's right for you. And if this is going to ruin your relationship with your son and you're the only support person he has, let's think about, getting you a safe storage lock. Let's think about some of these other tools that might be more appropriate. So it's messy.
We have one other question that came. Oh, when will they get their gun back? That was the.
Oh, yes, sorry. So again, the order is valid for up to 1 year. So if a full order is granted, it will be up for 1 year with the possibility for it to be renewed. So it really just depends, but the basic answer is 1 year.
Okay. And then one other question that came in was, what should I do if I hear from my kid that his friend is thinking about suicide and I know that their family has a gun in the house?
That is very tricky. Again, looking at this list, you are not a family or household member of that other parent's house. So I think one of the themes of this talk is conversation. And to definitely make sure that the parents of that child know that their child is suicidal. Definitely be asking, just like our, the previous speakers talked about, asking, are there guns in your house? Because that might be something that their child that might be the means that they're thinking of. So I would say definitely start with a conversation with the parents. And then if, again, we're kind of going through these various steps, but if it gets to the point where you really do have serious safety concerns, I of course have to advocate for calling 911 if there's no other option.
If it's the immediacy. And just one thing, Alyssa, that I wanted to mention was that if your child is still in school, and for example, in Lake Washington School District, our behavioral health sports specialists provide suicide risk assessments and consultations, and you can find out how to access that, and you have someone you can talk that through with, and make decisions about, you know, how to get in touch with that friend, how to intervene, etc. And so really, you know, having somebody help you work that through, but to make sure that it does come to the attention of the people who need to have it front and center, so that they can take whatever measures are available to them to keep someone safe.